And when people have all these fears and dystopian understandings of AI and the future and the Matrix and blah, 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 it's funny because we're walking straight into that. Because as long as AI thinks that we're the product, if we're just there to sell our energy, to sell our attention to the mother brain, we will.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Sky King. Sky is a podcast consultant. He's worked with some of the biggest names in podcasting, people like Aubrey Marcus and Chris Williamson. And he was super helpful to me in the launching of this show, which is part of why I wanted to have him on. Prior to getting into the podcasting world, Sky worked as a marketer inside of the pharmaceutical industry before stepping off of the beaten path to go break into podcasting. And he's been a student for years of the art and science of marketing and advertising. And I wanted to have Scott on the show to talk about some of the biggest lessons that he's learned about the history of advertising and marketing, some of the biggest campaigns that have worked throughout the years, how the process and also the norms of advertising have changed over time. I wanted to talk to him about what he sees in the evolution of the podcast space and how it is threatening and undermining legacy media and some of the biggest differences between legacy media and alternative media that independent content creators are building. And I wanted to talk to him about all of these things because I think they're really important for the education movement. Those of us who are building, either myself building an alternative brand with Rebel Educator, or people who are building schools and alternative programs who have to bring them to market and sell them to parents, we all have to think about marketing and advertising and getting messages that we think are important in front of an audience who wants to hear them. And so I wanted to talk to Sky about some of the biggest lessons that he's learned and some of the biggest things that he thinks are important for people building podcast brands to be thinking about. I also wanted to talk to him about his own backstory, his education, his experience stepping off of the status quo path and leaving a very comfortable career to go build a business inside of the podcasting world. We get into his personal philosophy as well. We talk about his love of surfing and a bunch of other interesting topics over the course of our conversation. I hope you find listening to this as fascinating as I found having this conversation. Sky King.
What's up?
My friend with possibly the coolest name out of all of my friends.
Thank you.
How you doing?
Doing great. It's been a great 10 days. The world's looking up. Let's go.
Why has it been a great 10 days?
I think a lot of it comes from just doing ice baths every morning. I think having that and waking up early, getting back on like a normal schedule, getting sun in my eyes, being one with the earth earlier in the day, and taking care of just my body a lot more. And then the ice bath is just a massive like hit of, I don't even know, like norepinephrine. And you just feel great.
Yeah, it's amazing how good an ice bath feels. What is your routine like besides ice bath? And also how long are you ice bathing every day?
Yeah, so wake up, we'll get over here to Squatch, drive with the windows down, I usually do. So I wake up, I put water with sea salt in it, real salt, Redmond real salt, so it has trace minerals in it. 30 grams of protein, I get that through a bone broth, so hot bone broth. Usually cottage cheese, one that's like heavy in like bacteria, and then like some sort of like cheese stick or meat stick or something, like the cleanest one I can get. Get here, I'll do this warm up that just helps with my mobility and surfing while in the sun. Try and do that on the grass over here at Squatch, not on the turf. And usually it takes about 10 minutes. It's a bunch of kind of like dynamic hip movements. It's based off of, I forget what it's called, but my trainer Dave, shout out to Dave, super into this like Japanese mobility martial art. So it's not really something you use it's like yoga, but Japanese and like has a bit of a martial component to it.
Oh, cool.
So I'll do that. And then I'll jump in the ice bath, just 3 minutes, super chill. I stopped timing it. What I really do is I just try and, my goal with it is going in with a calm breath, maintaining a calm breath, and then exiting with a calm breath. And then kind of just feeling out how long I want to go into it. I think a lot of people just like suffer through because they like don't know the temperature of the water. They haven't done it enough. And I think if you do something that you want to do every day and it's not a joy, but it's suffering, I think you're like re-traumatizing yourself over and over and over again. And I'm definitely trying to live life more in a space of joy. And so that's kind of what I orient around, is like getting it to feel good while in there, enjoying it the whole time, and then getting out without doing too much. Because you can, if you do too much ice, especially if you're doing it daily, especially if you time it wrong, like you can start to have negative side effects, such as decreased muscle growth.
Yeah, I am jealous of your morning ice bath routine. First of all, you have this whole thing down to a science. I love it.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how much better I feel when I do a cold plunge. And I feel like the effect lasts into the next day too, even. Like it feels like
For
a
sure.
long-term thing. So that's awesome. I love that you do that.
Yeah, I love cold water. I always have loved cold water. Like one of my favorite memories with my mom and I is we did a road trip from Northern California all the way up to Dark Horse, Alaska, which is basically like the end of the fucking road.
Whoa.
We were like 400 miles on a dirt road in our motorhome, and my mom and mine's favorite activity, just as we're bored driving through, was any body of water we saw, we would jump in and just like woo, like just like feel alive, and we loved doing it. And then when we got to Dark Horse, there's glaciers in the water around it. And we did this thing called the Polar Bear Club, where if you sat in for 10 minutes, you got like a hat. So I had this sick pink Polar Bear Club hat.
That's amazing. This is going on my road trip bucket list. I too am a person where every time I see a body of cold water, I want to jump in it. Cold ocean, cold lake, especially like an alpine lake. I always want to jump in, but a whole road trip around that sounds amazing.
It was epic. And it's crazy because like the alpine lakes can be so much colder than the ocean, like dramatically colder.
Yeah, the last alpine lake I swam in had, like, you could see the melting snow all around it, even though it was July. It was great. It's so much fun. I feel like there are a few things that make me feel more alive than cold water. Cold showers don't really do it for me for whatever reason. It feels just fake. But cold water out in nature, the best.
It's amazing.
So tell me a little bit. I want to talk about advertising with you, because this has been your area of specialty for a very long time. Can you, to start the conversation, just give a little bit of background on what your background in advertising is? Because you've been in the space. You started out working like more formally in marketing, then you got into podcasting. You've kind of gotten into these more niche spaces over time. Can you talk a little bit about your journey?
Yeah. So my dad was an entrepreneur. And one thing I learned really early on was that through capitalism, like you can make a massive positive impact on the world. You don't have to ask permission. You can go out and build things. And my dad was really fundamental in women's sports and building leagues and financial systems for women to be able to be professional athletes.
Can you talk about that for a second? Because that's just like a very cool background story.
Yeah. So my dad helped start like the women's tennis tour. His wife at the time was one of the most famous people in America, but was treated as a second-class citizen in her sport, which is tennis. She wasn't getting anywhere near equal prize money, even though the women at the time were driving a lot more attention. And my dad basically told Billy, her name was Billie Jean King, told her that like, look, you're being treated as a second-class citizen, like we should build something else. And so he helped kind of be the business side, and he was a lawyer to build that. But I think how he helped more than anything was he has always just had a mentality that you can build the world that you want to live in, and you shouldn't just accept the status quo. And so I think he really helped her see that, because she was focused on being the best in the world. And so that at a very young age kind of taught me that we can leverage this mechanism, this technology that is capitalism, to change the world in a way that we want to. And I've kind of just been searching for what that was going to be for me my whole life. You know, when I was a kid and people asked, oh, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I was like, I want to be an entrepreneur. And they're like, oh, and what? And I was like, I don't know, but it'll appear when the time is ready. And I was always very drawn towards media in the way in which media and media systems can impact people. And so my freshman year in college, one of my mentors, Yongnan Liu, he had created a club called Admin. It was Advertising Marketing Club on campus. He was a senior. He was kind of looking to focus on senior stuff, finding a job. So he had me become president of that club when I was a freshman. And then I started doing just these like crazy outlandish like YouTube videos and things that just drove attention to events and stuff that was happening on campus. And I love that. I then did like social media marketing for a few big influencers from 2012 through 2015. Kind of tried to start my first social media company. Didn't really go anywhere because I got distracted by school. And kind of during the 2016 election, leading up to it, I was working at a big pharma company, and they were flying me out to New York every week to go like work at a different pharma company to help them with their social media and new media stuff. And I was just shocked by the difference between how people talked about Donald Trump in Indiana and how people talked about him in New York. And in New York, it's like you couldn't get Donald Trump out of your mouth. And CNN, MSNBC was on in every bar. They're talking about him nonstop. In Indiana, people were talking about him, but it was nowhere near at the same level. But in New York, there's no chance he's going to win. In Indiana, it was like, oh, he could potentially win. And as I'm flying back and forth every week, I'm listening to podcasts the whole time. And podcasts were a lot more on the side of, no, he definitely has a shot. And then fast forward to reality and he won. And I just got really curious. And I was like, why was podcasting closer to reality? 2, why were the mainstream media organizations so wrong? And I just listened to a Tim Ferriss episode with this guy, Adam Robinson, and he said, the world always makes sense. It's your model of the world that doesn't make sense. And so then I started studying advertising. I read a book called The Brass Check and just going really, really deeper into the mechanisms of the monetization of media. And it made me realize that the outcome that CNN or like left-wing media wanted, they were actually working against that outcome because the real outcome they wanted was money. And so for context, from 2014 to 2016, CNN's ratings doubled. And so what Trump did was, and what CNN did, is they put him on nonstop, basically gave the election to him, at least at the primary level. He made money on his campaign until the end of the primaries. And they were building a world they didn't want because they're incentivized to. And that just like kind of sparked this obsession with podcasting because one, it was more true because it has more sincere, because it had the least amount of influence in advertising, and that's slowly shifting. And then 2, it's like we need to figure out a way to save podcasting so it doesn't just become the next, like captured by advertisers in the same way that every media system has, how social media has, and how our productization of ourselves has occurred like here in Western media, basically.
So when you say that CNN created a world that they didn't want, you're saying that they gave Trump tons of airtime because it drove up their ratings,
Yep.
And eventually it gave him enough airtime and enough reputation and recognition that he ended up actually winning the election, which wasn't their intention, but they were making so much money off of it that it was like the strategic play from a media standpoint.
Yes, for sure. Their incentives were not aligned with the world they wanted to live in.
So then why were podcasts more correct about him having a shot at winning? What were they getting that CNN was missing, or what were they enabled to talk about that made them more right?
They could speak more freely just about the reality of what was occurring. So they could get closer to reality because they weren't being... In order to run a podcast, even the biggest podcast in the world, it takes 3 people. So when, the Washington Post or CNN loses a major sponsor, people get fired. When a podcaster loses a sponsor, like nobody notices, including the podcaster.
Yeah. So you're not, there's no tethers that are preventing you from telling the truth or calling things as you see them.
At least being sincere. I always like shy away from the truth word just because it's hard to know. But at least like saying what you think and see.
That's fair. And I would think also the medium itself also lends itself to, you can have a more nuanced conversation about something. You can go into more detail. You can perhaps be more explorative than you can be on, a news segment.
Why do you think you can't be explorative, or why can't you be nuanced, or why do you have to talk in such short thoughts on CNN?
Is this do you know the answer to this question? Yeah. Well, I assume because they're just cramped for time.
They're cramped for time because they have to get in 4 to 5 commercial breaks within each segment.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's literally the model of advertising is what has built the thing that we see and is projected onto us today.
I feel like this is just sort of like a fractal metaphor for the world that we live in at large, where we have this very stark competition between these very bloated institutional top-heavy systems that we have sort of coalesced over the past 100 years in every industry, from education to media to healthcare to whatever. And then this like sort of scrappy, agile internet era movement of independent education and more alternative healthcare and like alternatives to the system and alternative media like podcasts, which I don't know if alternative media is even fair anymore because podcasts are so mainstream now. It's not really the alternative. It kind of is the status quo. We just don't want to admit it.
Yeah, it's still, I wouldn't say it's full like status quo yet. I would say definitely Rogan wouldn't be called alternative anymore. Like he definitely is, as an individual like broadcaster, the largest in the world. But there's still, I forget the last numbers, but it's something around like 70 to 100 million people I think are listening to podcasts. So that's still very small relative to the world.
It is, but that's still a lot of people.
It's a lot of people for sure.
To be reaching. So what about, so if the segments are so short on the news because they have to fit in all these commercial breaks, why are they're also very shallow. Like they don't really go into a lot of nuance and detail. It's very basic talking points. Why is that?
So it's hard to say like super broadly, like everyone will have, it's different. I think if you think about how they've set up though, if it's a 30-minute show, you have 20 minutes of actual content. And I think they're trying to, let's say if it's like CNN or The Tonight Show, it's like they're trying to hit like 3 to 4 stories within that. And so you can hit different pieces of the population. It's kind of like when we talk about like launching a podcast and trying to think of like 3 to 6 topics that you want to talk about through that, you know what I mean? Because you're hitting different demos that way. So if they're trying to fit in 3 to 4 stories in order to hit different demos that keeps at least, each quarter percentage of the population interested, then that leaves, 4 to 5 minutes. And if you have 2 people on that or 3 people on, like 2 hosts and 1 person, that leaves about 1.5 minutes for each person to speak.
I feel like, so I grew up, I didn't watch the news at all. I don't watch the news as an adult either. So when I watch it as a very outside observer, it feels a little bit like the interviews after a sports game where you just you talk to whoever scored the winning goal or whatever. And you're like, how did that feel? Like, what was the pivotal moment? And they just kind of say the same things over and over. It's like, well, I'm like really grateful to my team. And like, we really, really like drove it home at the end. And like, we weren't really sure there for a minute, but like we all rallied and like the coach was great and whatever. Like, it's always kind of the same talking points. It doesn't really go into much detail. It's kind of boring. And I find watching the news kind of the same. Like, you don't actually learn anything of substance.
Yeah, I just feel a little bit more afraid.
Yeah, a little more afraid, and you can, pretend to feel informed. It's like, well, I did. It's weird. I feel like watching the news is this very socially, almost mandated proxy for being well informed. Because I wouldn't consider watching the news to be terribly informative, really, of what's going on. But it's very socially acceptable to watch the news and then consider yourself well-informed. And it's also very socially almost necessary in some ways. Like, I feel like you get, it depends on what social circles you're in, but I feel like it's easy to even get, like, for it to feel like you're not doing your civic duty if you're not paying attention to what's going on. But it feels like such a proxy because you're not getting anything of substance. You're not getting multiple sides of a story. You're hearing different pundits arguing their talking points on an issue and getting like, the very basic headlines about what's happening. But it's very weird to me that that's a culturally acceptable norm for collecting information about what's happening on a societal level, because it feels so lacking to me.
I think it's a throwback to a forgotten era where, historically, like the best investors, the most thoughtful people, my grandfather, they would sit and they would read 2 to 3 newspapers, in the morning to start their day. And, going through each newspaper, you're getting snapshots of all these stories, but there's a lot more complexity to it than just the news, right? And then they took that and then like simplified it to just, 3 to 5 stories that you can get in 30 minutes on your way to work really quickly. So that's like, I think giving it the benefit of the doubt of where it came from. I think news today is largely co-opted by 2 different teams. And I think what you're learning is your talking points to say during the day from those teams right now.
Yeah, I think that definitely appears to me. Again, as an outside observer, I don't think I'm terribly qualified to comment on what's going on a deep level because I'm not immersed in it at all, but that definitely appears to be true. Which again, as somebody who's outside of the matrix, it seems very weird to me. It's like, just read Twitter. You get the same things. And honestly, more nuance because you're hearing more people's takes. which
Yeah.
feels more useful to me.
For sure. Even with Twitter though, and with the news, it's like you're being. I was in a discussion last night with a few other podcast like people / one person who does short form content. He just sold his company to Morning Brew.
Oh, nice.
And we were talking about the value of podcasts or long form content versus short form. And I was basically saying, I can't remember a tweet I read today. I promised you I read hundreds and I saw thousands. I can't remember a single one, but I could remember that in 2002 when Kelly Slater was up for the World Championship of Surfing. If you don't know who that is, in the World Surfing Championship, the night before, his girlfriend at the time got in a fight with him and he didn't sleep the entire night and he knew he was going to lose the championship and like what that meant for him and how he actually learned so much from that experience. And I can remember that because I was engaged listening to a podcast with Tim Ferriss and him. They did it 5 years ago. And just how much that stuff will stick in your brain a lot more, which I think goes back to the newspaper example versus the clips that you get on mainstream media.
Because the newspaper clips have more nuance to them, more detail.
You like integrate with it more. You're reading it within context of other ones. You're choosing yourself when to switch from one to the next. I think like you're anchoring in a story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's incredibly important for humans' capacity to remember. Like if you go back, pre-writing things down, I think Plato said the pencil isn't a tool for remembering, it's a tool for forgetting. And I think stories are insanely important for us to contextualize stuff in our mind and to remember things.
Yeah.
And Twitter, it's thoughts sans context a lot of times.
Yeah, I'm very pro Twitter in a lot of ways. I think it's a really great way to build reach, to build influence. I think a lot of really interesting people hang out on Twitter. Mm-hmm. So it can be a really helpful place to build some clout because you can reach really interesting people very quickly and jump in on conversation. I like that it's an open forum where people can debate with each other and you can jump in on anyone's thread and leave a comment. And if you actually say something insightful, the algorithm's going to, people are going to like it. The algorithm's going to bump it up. The original tweeter might see it. Even if they have a huge following, you might be able to engage with them. That's really cool.
Yeah.
You can't do that on a podcast. Mm-hmm. But I definitely think, there's the reason I love podcasting so much is because I'm able to really flesh out my thoughts in conversation with somebody in a way that it makes me sharper as a thinker in a way that I don't think Twitter can. But it also allows me to add so much more nuance that is useful to the listener too, which I find really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into the podcast world? So you were working in...
I was working in Big Pharma.
Mm-hmm. And then the Trump election happened. Mm-hmm. You got podcast pilled, basically.
Yeah.
What happened from there?
So then I decided to start my own podcast, and I used kind of all my marketing knowledge that I had experienced, and with no audience, was able to get 1,600 to 2,000 downloads a month, which was like pretty decent for a super local podcast, and just became obsessed with it and was having so much fun with it. And so then I started just listening to more and more podcasts, trying to figure out how I could get into podcasting. I had been emailing Ryan Holiday every once in a while for a few years, just asking advice, books to read and stuff. And he's one of those dudes, at least at the time, would email basically everybody back. This is before he had, like millions of subs on stuff, but he was already like a best-selling author, like multi-time over. And he had just written Conspiracy, which is by far my favorite book on him. It's basically how Peter Thiel took down Gawker. It's fantastic. If you haven't read it, highly recommend. It's one of those that I left work early. I had it coming to me, but I wanted to read it so bad that I just went to a bookstore and got it. And I just sat, and it was a rainy day. I just sat and drank tea and read it the whole day. And it was amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah. And he was like, you should check out Gary Vee, like really consider working for him. And I was like, I just watched him interview for Conspiracy and it was awful. And it's like, give him another shot. And on that, there's a guy named Aubrey Marcus who had read his book and was familiar with his podcast. I knew he was really good friends with Tim Ferriss and with Joe Rogan and lived here in Austin and deep in the podcasting space. And on it, he mentioned my godmother, Billie Jean King. And I was like, oh shit, because his mom lost to her at Wimbledon. And I was like, damn, okay. And so I texted Billie. I was like, do you know who this woman is? She's like, oh yeah, have you heard from her? Like, how's she doing? I'm like, no, but I think I'd like to like get connected with her son. She's like, find her number and I'll give her a call. I'm like, thanks. So I go like reverse Google search numbers that could be connected to Kathy Harder in Dripping Springs in Austin, like around this area. And I found like 15 or 10 numbers or something. I sent them all to my dad because he knew her as well. And he called every single one until she picked up. And then they got to connect. got to Billy. Billy got to Aubrey. Aubrey's like, yeah, I'll interview him. So I flew down, talked with him, and he was like, I don't have a position for you. You seem smart. I think I'd like to have you on the team, but I want to see your commitment level. If you really want to do this, you can quit your big boy job, which I was on, like MBA track, like big, like good pay. So I quit that to go make smoothies at the Onnit gym. And so I did that for about like a month. And then the VP of marketing of Onnit and I were talking in the sauna, and he's like, what are you doing? Like making smoothies, like come work for me. And I was like, okay, cool. So I started working for him. Aubrey saw that and he's like, dude, what the fuck? I thought you wanted to work for me. And I was like, yeah, dude, I'm making smoothies right now though. And then so I started that in October. And then I think in January, I joined his team officially. And so I kind of was his director of marketing and advertising. So I built an ads business for him. He'd never monetized his podcast before. So that was my foray into that. I had him and Kyle Kingsbury. I did both of those. And then I also kind of ran his whole podcast operation. Worked with Ryan Giles, an amazing producer. And then I was kind of the marketing side of it. So I would choose the clips, write the copy, helped him grow his Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, got him to 100,000 subs on YouTube, got a plaque with my name on it, which is sick.
Nice.
We went from 160,000 downloads an episode to 230,000 downloads an episode in about 9 months.
Whoa.
Built a 6-figure ads business off of it. And then when Aubrey stepped down as CEO of Onnit in 2020 or 2019 going into 2020, Onnit offered me a job to run their podcast marketing. And Aubrey was like, you should start your own company now. And so February of 2020, I started Modern Stoa. Great timing, because it was the only dip the podcast advertising, podcast space has ever experienced was March of 2020 because people stopped driving like completely. But yeah, it was amazing.
So you didn't have any experience doing podcast ads when you started doing them for Aubrey, right?
So I'd started Kyle like about a month before because Kyle was like, I need to figure out a way to make money. Onnit gave me the podcast. I was like, I'll do deals for you. And so I started doing deals for him. And then Aubrey was like, how much is Kyle making? He was like, what the fuck? Okay, can you do that for me? And at the time I was like, heck yeah, I can. Like I would have done it for you whenever you wanted. And so yeah, I had no idea what to do, but we just started doing it.
How much of what you'd learned from big pharma advertising translated over versus how much was this a completely different game?
I think the thing that helped me is that I was more sophisticated in marketing than most of the people I talked to on the phone for the brands. They like one thing that big pharma does is they're the greatest marketers in the world. They have the greatest systems in the world. They spend the most. Like I spent an entire year focusing on just, what we've spent. Well, we're coming up on here, but what we spent like one meeting talking about with like positioning and building out the brand and the brand character map in the target market. Like I spent an entire year just doing that, just to learn like how to do that super well for one brand. And going through market research and having those tools. And so when I could communicate with the brand, it was really easy to see for me, like who their target market probably was. And so I could like very easily communicate why it was aligned with their target market. I could also debate like the values of brand marketing versus performance marketing. And at the time, most of the people sponsoring podcasts, the people within them, they're performance marketers, which basically means they're looking for a direct ROI, which is kind of something built off of Facebook ads and Google ads, not ROI, but the performance marketing space. So yeah.
So why is big pharma better at advertising than anybody else in the world?
2 things. So 3 things. 1, pharmaceuticals are a very complex market because you have 3 customers and you have to get really strategic in how you think about that. And so one thing that the company I worked for did super well was we would basically start to think about the patient first, and we would identify who that patient is. And then we would put that patient in front of doctors and see how well it resonated. And then we would see which doctors it resonated with best. So customer 1, who's taking the drug. Customer 2, who's prescribing the drug. Customer 3, who's paying for the drug. And we got super specific. It's like, okay, we've identified the target market of the patient. We've detailed her. We know who I was working in metastatic breast cancer, so we know who she is. Now, what kind of doctors, age demographic, where they work, what they prescribe, how aggressive they are, see that patient and resonate with them and see them as like a huge portion of their practice. And with that, which payer systems then like pay for those doctors? Which places are they in? How do we allow the payer system to see that patient, to see that doctor? And so you're really looking at this like 3-sided market and you're approaching it from so many different angles. And the infrastructure is just so big and so strong and has been done for so long and has made so much money and spent so much time on these huge bloated marketing organizations that we've just kind of built out like the best practices.
So what were, besides creating these customer personas, what were some of the other things that you learned from big pharma marketing specifically that you've carried over into the marketing strategies that you've built since, both for Aubrey's podcast and then for the business that you've built since?
So the most obvious one for the business I'm doing is pricing.
Mm-hmm.
So I did my 2 jobs basically while I was there was global branding and global pricing. So I didn't work in the US. I worked globally, which was way better from a pricing perspective because the US pricing I think is corrupt. But just trying to understand how important it is to think long-term when you're pricing.
Mm-hmm.
Having to walk podcasters down from thinking, oh, I should charge super high off the gate versus we can make it really competitive, build a really good brand around pricing, get people early success. They want to keep paying, getting long-term contracts. The importance of like pricing well, how to think about pricing, how to, make money on the long term, how not to compete on price, to hold a premium, how you hold a premium, how you communicate a premium. Basically, if you start to compete on price, you're racing to the bottom. Mm-hmm. You're seeing this a lot in short form agencies right now as they're all competing on price by outsourcing their work to the Philippines or to Eastern Europe. And so when you compete on price, you basically you're just on a race to zero.
What about in terms of like positioning a brand? Because I know this is something you and I have talked about this quite a bit. And I know this is something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. What are some of the biggest things you've learned there?
Yeah, so positioning goes a lot back to that persona thing. So what I'd build is at this time was called like a brand character map. And it's basically like taking into account your competitive set, what you can uniquely do within your competitive set, what you so your product is uniquely suited for. And so like the thing that we tend to I work through with clients is like, who are you? What are you trying to do in the world, aka product? For what audience and why you are uniquely suited to do it for the audience. And that's something that I created kind of based off of like simplifying this whole year-long process of identifying all these like 5 different specific things to bring it to one sentence that we can get to, or like a paragraph. And I think to back end, the way that I learned about that and why it's so important in marketing is so many people just try to go broad and be everything to everyone, and they almost always lose. So like even Amazon, which is called the everything store, it started as a bookstore. Mm-hmm. And then as it started super niche, right? And if you look at the people who failed during the .com bubble, is the people trying to be the everything store at that time. It's like, I'm everything for pets. Like that's the most famous example, right? Pets.com. But it's like, no, you have to start out incredibly niche. And the reason why you have to start out incredibly niche, and people don't go deep into this enough, but you need to find people who can be your early adopters, and you have to find them where they are and know that they'll become like evangelized, like a jihad for your movement. And so that's like what you're really doing with that positioning is you're identifying those early customers who can give feedback, who can become obsessed with you, who can help share your message via word of mouth. Like it's very important to do this in order to know who you're targeting. You save money and you also resonate well. And so you have a lot more opportunity for virality.
So how does that translate over into building a podcast brand? Because I know that's something that you've worked with people quite a bit on over the years.
Like for podcasters?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then that's where I simplified it into those 4 questions, right? And so when you're thinking about the adoption of your podcast, especially when you don't have an audience, but even when you do, only let's say you have a 100,000 person follower on Twitter. Only a subset of your audience is going to listen to podcasts. Mm-hmm. And so you have to identify who those subset are basically and why they're going to be there to listen to you and why they should listen to you and how you can get them to share. And so that's kind of been like the biggest translation for me. And it's just been also observing podcasters who have done it super, super well. And some people, it takes them 3 to 5 years to find their niche, and some people have it like super specific. But the other thing it really, really does, I think is super beneficial, is it helps you go on other shows, because very few people, like comedians will, but very few other people want to just have like a generalist who can shoot the shit. They want to have someone on that they can learn from. And that also helps you capture portions of their audience, because it's like they are the people that I can learn the most from on a specific subject. So then they'll throw you into their queue.
Right. So I spend a lot of time thinking about a lot of these things that you're talking about from the perspective of communicating ideas that are counter to the mainstream, but that have quite a bit of validity to them. For me, there are a few different topics that are of interest to me, but the biggest one is education.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I love about podcasting is, this is the libertarian in me speaking, but it's so decentralized. It's so authority agnostic that you don't have to get anyone else's permission to build out a show where you're talking about the things that you find interesting. The same thing holds true for Twitter, for building out a Substack list, like any aspect of building a content brand. It's very democratized. Like you can just go start saying things, and it's very capitalistic. Like if you're saying things that people find valuable, they will follow you, which is very cool because you can say things that if you were working through a deeper bureaucracy, people might not want you to say. But you have to say things in a way that people are going to resonate with, and you have to package messaging very carefully. And this is a thing I've spent a ton of time thinking about for years, but especially over this past year as I've been building out my education media brand. I've been thinking a lot about, I have a lot of criticisms of the public school system, as you well know. And I need to package those things in a way that resonates with people, and they hear me talking about it, and they say, yes, this hits a chord in me. This hits on something that I intuitively feel to be true. But at the same time, a thing that, like, I have to say it in a way that's radical enough to get people's attention, but not so radical that it scares people off. And I feel like whenever people are building a brand, especially when they're talking about something, we'll just say interesting, something that's a little different from the status quo, this is a set of questions that they have to think through too. It's like positioning. And I'm curious what lessons you've learned from both your time in advertising, like more in the mainstream, and also from podcasting that relate to that specifically. And we can you can take this wherever you want. If you want to contextualize this around the brand that I'm building, like we can dig into the weeds there. If you want to talk about it more broadly, because that's what's clicking for you, that's fine too. But I feel like there's something interesting here about the positioning that I'd like to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah. First, what comes up for me from that is Purple Cow for some reason by Seth Godin. Have you read that?
I haven't read it, but I'm familiar.
Yeah, so it's like, how do you make something unique and interesting? And you need to have a stance or a position, right? One thing that can become complicated than that is, I think, more than a position, before you go to like, I'm going to say something interesting, it's like you have to decide those like 4 questions we talked about. And what those are really bringing up is kind of your values and your value. So like value. And what I mean by that is like, what am I going to stay true to over the life cycle of this product? Because, you might be able to say something a lot more radical in the beginning, and that'll evangelize that small group of people. But eventually you're going to have to break into that next adoption in the adoption life cycle. And so you have to be very, very core to, as you maybe deflavor some of your context, like to what the actual values are and what you're doing. And then to what the value that you're providing is. And so that's why I think it's really important to do that work up front, to think about that. To you specifically, I think that you're doing a great job at it so far. I don't have like a ton of feedback or thoughts there. Other than, I do think one area that you're good at because of your unique experience, like thinking to you and being homeschooled, is I think that you can do a lot more by showing instead of telling. And I think like stepping farther into that with the evangelized group of people that you've told all this to and have been like, education pilled around it, I think will start to benefit you a lot more, because people will start to see you as an embodiment of that experience. And that's where it's really unique as a podcaster or as like a personal brand versus a product, because it is kind of a product, but it's also you. And so by you showing and experiencing and doing great things, it is just casting the path that which people can follow and become interested in.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It gets very different when you start to talk about the personal level, because it's also, you don't want to put yourself into a box. What you want to do is just be the best expression of you.
Yeah. And that's part of why I love the art form of podcasting so much, is because it's this continuous exercise of drawing more of yourself out and crystallizing it and distilling it and communicating it. But also, that's one of the things I've learned this year for sure, is it's a very different game to build a brand versus a personal brand. And there are limitations to both, and both have their benefits. But there is something unique you can do with a personal brand, which is part of why I love podcasts so much too, is because you really get to feel the flavor of the person who's holding the space for the interviews to happen. So you can hear somebody who you've heard on a million other podcasts, but if this unique person can ask unique questions, it's very cool. And you're obviously very pro podcast. You listen to podcasts all the time. You help people launch podcasts. You got into this podcasting space years ago and have been immersed deeply in it ever since. But we were talking the other night and you said podcasting is dead technically.
Yeah.
I want you to expand on that.
Yeah. So it was something I realized as I've been working more in YouTube and with Spotify, who now does video. And if you launch on Anchor, you have to actually ask them to create an RSS feed, because they won't create one naturally for you. Like, it's like an extra step. And so like historically, podcasting was an RSS based platform. So essentially RSS originated in blogging. It's something that's just this one-way channel where the super decentralized, the person who like owns the feed can just put content out, and then it's just received by the other end of it by the subscriber of the RSS feed. And it's automatically downloaded, automatically brought into the system. There's a lot of inefficiencies there. There's a lot of beauty there, but that is what a podcast was technically. Now that, for a lot of podcasters, 60% of their viewership is coming from Spotify video or YouTube, they're not using an RSS feed. And though YouTube did just build in an RSS feature into their thing, it's not super necessary and it's kind of going away. And so then how do we technically define a podcast? And so I kind of came to the realization that, it's technically broken or dead. And so what does that mean? What it means is that the most popular podcast in 2015 was Serial. If we put Serial in a video podcast, what makes it not a true crime show, like a TV show or a YouTube show? And the reason why I think people will continue to use the term podcasting is because for now, it tends to be associated with an audience that is more educated and has more disposable income, which means they can perform better for advertisers. So we will continue to call it podcasting forever. I was then talking with my friend Eric Jorgensen, and he and I were kind of like thinking through this. And I think he had the idea, but maybe we came up together, I don't really remember. But that the only technical definition of what a podcast is right now is it has to be something that you don't lose too much if you're only listening to it. So let's say, and it's just funny because like I used to reverse this when we were starting to push people to video, because YouTube was a lot more of a science for growth than podcasting is, which is a lot more of an art for growth. What I realized was that we could create a little bit of FOMO, just a tad, that would push people to video. So, that shirt's fucking dope.
Thank you.
Yeah. Pull up this clip.
Mm-hmm.
These little things where you're not missing the point of the story, but you want to see what's going on.
Yeah. Dude, your hair looks great today.
Exactly. Dude, Sky, you did your hair purple. It's fucking crazy.
Yeah, you guys got to check out this video. It's insane.
It's insane. Little stuff like that. And it's like, right now, I think it's the question to me that I find interesting is like, what's the percentage at which it flips when it can no longer be quality enough that you're missing too much that you can't just turn it on and listen? And I would really recommend people creating in this space to not go that far. And the reason is because podcasting creates a very unique dynamic at the audio level. It's incredibly intimate. You live your most important lives while you're spending time with these thinkers, philosophers, comedians. Those are all the same word. They're same people, but... And so, like, I can remember when I flew down to meet Aubrey for the first time. It was 4th of July weekend. It was the 5th of July. And I was listening to a podcast episode of him on Tim Ferriss. And I remember that. And I remember experiencing life on that flight and the feelings I was going through, the nervousness, the excitement, the energy, just the salto mortale of my life at that point, just the full send. And I can remember, listening to Ryan Holiday in 2017 after Caroline and my wife, had just gone to a family reunion, and just thinking to myself like, oh, that's such an interesting concept of like stoicism and how to be less reactive and dealing with a lot of reactive people over the weekend, and how that fundamentally changed my life. And I can remember experiencing all of these moments with these people in my head, whether it's washing dishes, driving to surf, driving to a first date. Like, you become that person in that limbic space, that third space that you spend with them all the time. And that has so much value. I know people who have gotten off of heroin because Joe Rogan is one of the 5 people they spent the most time with. People who've lost 50 pounds because they love Tim Ferriss. And that level of intimacy, it just can't be reached with video. And so I do recommend people really stay finding that balance between, yes, we want it enough to be visually stimulating, but not so much that it takes away from it not being a quote unquote podcast anymore.
How do you anticipate this evolving as video platforms become more and more of a part of podcasting? The, clips and highlight reels become more and more of a part of podcast distribution, especially on social media. It becomes easier and easier to add sound effects, bells and whistles, all kinds of other like detail to podcasts. How do you see the podcast landscape changing? Do you have any hypotheses on what's going to happen, how it's going to evolve?
The thing that scares me the most, and this goes back to originally my thesis on advertising and why podcasting had more sincerity in media, is actually the podcast networks. That's what I worry about the most. I think we'll go through phases of like what's hot, what's working all the time. I think people will return to long form audio continuously. And I think that because it's an incredibly human thing. Like, this is back to, again, the Plato quote, right? It's like, this is how we communicated, through story and through conversation, through nuance. Like in Lincoln's time, the debates were 7 hours, and I think no matter how much we push towards short form, I think there's going to be a reaction back into this long form. The thing that scares me, though, with networks, and I've seen this play out in real time, is when you're a network, when you subscribe your podcast to a network, they are responsible for your production and they're responsible for your monetization. And it immediately, I've seen it happen within like a fucking month of a brand that a podcaster doesn't want to have on, and the network says like, tough shit, we have to monetize, and this is the product that we're selling. And then they get to say, we saw a lot of stuff during COVID. It's like, you get to get blocked out on what you're saying there. And it starts to decrease the sincerity in media. And I think that would be the death of podcasting more than transformation and formation. It's more about the business model of it and how we can allow for sincere, nuanced conversations to happen.
Well, it's kind of, it's pulling it back into the mainstream media model again.
Exactly.
Which you've talked about media's prostitution before. You've also made that, drawn that connection. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so this comes from like my biggest Quake book that I mentioned earlier, The Brass Check. It's a book by Upton Sinclair. Most people know Upton Sinclair because he wrote The Jungle. And everybody loved The Jungle. All the media. It's like, ooh, look at how bad corporations are. They're making kids work in really horrible situations, which I don't mean to belittle. That was awful. But his most important book, by his own accord, his magnus opum, the book that destroyed his career, it destroyed his reputation, was a book called The Brass Check. And it was all about the business model of media. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Brass Check because basically there is this brothel where you would get a brass check and then you'd give that to the prostitute when you got his or her services. And then the prostitute would then go back to the John or the Madame, like the pimp or the Madame. The John is the person giving the brass check. Mm-hmm. And they would exchange the brass check for money. And that's essentially what's going on with advertising is the creators are prostitutionalizing to us their art, because we're not actually purchasing it from them. We're purchasing it from this like middleman, and what's being sold is us. And so it gets a little murky on who the real prostitute is. It's part creator, part us. Mm-hmm. but we're definitely like devaluing the artistic experience and expression that like what media is. And this has been happening forever. It really started taking off in the 40s, but it's been the game for a very, very long time.
Why did it start taking off in the 40s?
Yeah, so this dude, Henry Luce, who's the founder of Time Inc., he was the CEO of Fortune, Time, Life magazine. He went to FDR in 1941 and basically got advertising to be thought of as pre-tax, so you could use it as an expense. Whereas before that point, it was something that was taken out of your profits. And over the next decade, the yearly spend on advertising increased by $9 billion in those terms. And so it's like something like $100 billion today.
That's insane.
It's insane. And again, he came through it from a virtuous place. It's like you have the Conservation Corps, you have the war efforts, people, it's, right after the Great Depression, like people aren't paying for this enough. If you want to get your message out, if you want the government to know all the good stuff you're doing, if you want to get elected again, blah, 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 like how are they going to hear about it? Like we should make it free.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing is free. And especially stuff that people spend their entire life working on isn't free, shouldn't be free.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been insane, negative externalities around that. One thing that, we talked about earlier and I talked about in my TED Talk was around the tobacco industry. So in 1941, it was actually pretty common to write about the dangers of smoking cigarettes, both from like a health perspective and a fire perspective and on planes and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then from 1942 to 1971, there's an advertising-induced blackout where it was mentioned almost 0 times. I think Reader's Digest is one of the few magazines that kept speaking about it, which in itself is like a hilarious study in the incentive models of media, which we can talk about, Reader's Digest. And, there's estimations that killed, millions and millions of people because we just didn't talk about something that doctors knew was unhealthy. But again, they were being paid by the tobacco companies, that the tobacco companies knew unhealthy. A lot of the journalists did. And it was, got cut at the editorial board every time something tried to go across the plate because they were one of the largest advertisers. They were the people that were spending that money.
Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by a media-induced blackout? Can you talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that? Like you touched on it briefly there, but can you expand a little bit more?
Yeah, sorry, I meant advertising-induced blackout. So essentially,
I'm sorry. I think that's what you said, and I misquoted. But
yeah,
anyway.
So advertising-induced blackout is basically like, if you run this article, we're going to pull our advertising. So you will have to fire your team, the team you've built, the people who have children, the people who have families to take care of, the people that you go to potlucks, you're going to have to sit them down and fire them because you wrote this article. Which
goes back to the incentive models of mainstream media thing that you mentioned. Can you expand on that too?
Yeah, so when you think about it that way, it's what you're realizing is that the people who are actually deciding what is being said and what is within, the Overton window, what is an allowable conversation through our sense-making apparatus, which is what the media is supposed to be, the way in which we intuit, understand all the things going on in the world that we as individuals don't have time to go out and research and figure out, is being filtered through something by the people who pay for it. And when you don't pay for the product, you are the product. That's just like someone's paying for it. Nothing is free. Mm-hmm. And so what we're looking at here is a system where our entire sense-making apparatus, how we think and understand reality, because the words we use and the things we talk about are the reality in which we live in, are being decided upon or at least allowed to pass through this massive filter, which is this advertising filter. And when they want to black something out, like the dangers of smoking cigarettes, it gets blacked out. And then therefore it's not spoken about for 30 years.
Which is insane.
And then we have,
millions of people
die.
Yeah, which is crazy. So how do you think about then, about paywalled content? Because this is something I wrestle with a lot, because I like the incentive structure of paywalled media as a capitalist, but as someone who wants to have influence and reach, ungated content is the best way to obviously reach new people. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, so I think that's a false dichotomy.
Expand.
But before getting into that, just like to answer it directly.
Yeah.
We are never going to beat Facebook with Patreon. It's already, advertising has been subsidies. The genie's out of the hat. I love that Substack exists. My podcast is on a private feed or NFTs. And so you can listen on an NFT platform, or you can, if you want to have it on your podcasting platform, you have to pay to subscribe. But those are not the only two options. And what I'm really interested in are new business models of media, like how we can build new incentive structure. So one of my favorite ones to think about that'll hit both of those is something like, I think Vitalik referred to it as quadratic funding. But essentially imagine that you set a threshold, and let's say it's $10. So once you receive $10, so you have your super fans, and your super fans can get access to the podcast early. And especially if it's really important information or stuff they're addicted to, it's like, okay, they can pay $1 and they can get access early. You have a super small podcast, so you have 10 super fans. They each pay $1. As soon as it hits the $10 threshold, boom, now it's out in the public, and now it's open access to everybody. And so if you can create such valuable content that it's of value to them to get it early enough, I think you can start to build models that can occur. Another way to look at it would be like a gamification model. So I would love a world, and the world that I would like to build is one where we can bet on our favorite creators and what's going to happen within their lives or within their world. And so we can start to compete to say, like, who is the biggest fan, who knows the most about Tim Ferriss, who can answer the questions, who can put the content out there, and actually place bets on prediction markets, and then have oracles determine if it's going to be real or not real, and if reality unfolded that way. And then the creator would get like a portion of all bets that go down on their platforms.
That's such a cool model.
Yeah.
I love that.
Another one is what I call meme farming. So for podcasters, the thing that they hate the most and take the most work are creating the clips and promoting it on all these other platforms just to get some sort of visibility, because there's not a good native discoverability feature within podcasts.
Yeah.
And advertising. So this is like a two-way, like pronged approach to fix this. And it's something that I kind of like created/tested back in 2021, and it works super well for my podcast. I think I probably had like per listen to money made, probably like the highest ratio of any podcaster ever. I think we had like 15 downloads and sold it for $12,000.
Whoa.
So like that ratio is super good, all using this like meme farming concept that I built. And what it is like when you have your fans, your super fans who can listen to the podcast live, and they can all compete to buy and own as NFTs certain moments of that podcast, I think that it can really, one, help spread your podcast through virality through doing these clips that people hate, but two, give people a more in-depth ownership into the podcast and to become a part of it with you and ride that journey with you. You know, I've been listening to Rogan since like 2014. I've been listening to Ferriss since 2015. I've been listening to Ryan Holiday since 2015. And I have had a huge benefit in my lives from that, but it would have been sick to get some of the upside of their growth too as an early subscriber. You know what I mean? And having like early access to that. And so I think that now that we have native currencies of the internet, now that we have native tools of the internet, there are an unlimited amount of business models we can create with media if we just get a little bit creative, and they will do so much better than the traditional models. Because in order to beat advertising in podcasts, which has one of the highest CPMs, you just have to value the person's time that's listening, one listener, at 0.02 cents per minute. And so in my mind, if you can get them to pay $1 a month in fun ways, not through subscription, but through like betting, through ownership, through asking questions, paying $1 to ask a question, you are like destroying like 50x on what an advertiser is going to value their attention at.
Interesting. There are a lot of models to play with.
So
here.
many.
It's really cool. You also talk about the walled garden concept quite a bit. You mentioned it earlier in our conversation before we started recording. How does that relate to all of this?
Yeah. So,
and can you define it too for those uninitiated?
Yeah. So walled garden is what when I'm referring to this, and I don't know like how colloquial this is, but how I'm thinking about it is Web 1.0 was the open internet. You know, where a lot of time people were self-serving. Or self-hosting. You can access anything just through a browser. Like the browser is like kind of like this beautiful little UX to travel through this third reality. And then during Web 2.0, what they did is they went and consolidated people's information and internet experience into these various web-based apps and then app-based apps. Mm-hmm. And when you sign that terms of service, what you're actually doing is you're getting rid of ownership of your content. You're giving ownership over to them, but they have the eyeballs, so it makes it worth it, and they can promote you. And if you play their games, then you get famous. But I think what that is doing is it's giving people, especially people born into Web 2.0, a false sense of the capabilities of what the internet is. And I think a lot of the promise of a Web 3 and Web 3.0, if you consider that crypto, a lot of people have moved that into a different term, maybe even like quantum computing or other stuff, but is you can go back to this like decentralized version of the internet where people are relaying to the internet and the media of the internet more as the product. The other problem with the walled gardens is it really went on this model of first to free, because it was just about getting as many people on the app as possible and then figuring out how to monetize later. And they thought, okay, and if like an elegant business model is advertising, so let's just go with that because it was the status quo. And so in that instance, you immediately became the product. And, this is like explicitly written out in a book called like, What Would Google Do? And it's all about how to become a platform and first to free and how you have to be free. And like, because again, you're making the people the product. And I think that if we can break down those walls and have people own their data a lot more and also pay for media, even in a very, very fun way, we will have and giving people also the technological tools and understanding in order to scrub the web, to actually be able to engage with the internet, know how to be safe on it outside of these walled gardens. Because what they promised is what any wall promises. They promise safety, security, and ease, right? And what do you give up with that? Freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that it's been like a really sad thing to happen in our psychological development as a culture that we decided to enter into these walled gardens versus taking the risk of venturing into the world. And I think it's really heading a direction that nobody wants it to, where we are just continualizing, productizing ourselves. And when people have all these fears and dystopian understandings of AI and the future and the Matrix and blah, 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 it's funny because we're walking straight into that. Because as long as AI thinks that we're the product, if we're just there to sell our energy, to sell our attention to the mother brain, we will. And so I do think it's an existential problem at some level, like at a massive level, as we continue to interact with technology. Is technology going to be the tool that we use, or are we going to be the tool that technology uses? And the entire business model of the internet right now is set up for technology to be the tool that uses us, for AI to be the tool that uses us. Because as long as we keep being the product, like that's how we end up being the little babies in the Matrix and cells where they just are harvesting our energy.
I was going to ask you, what do you think of ChatGPT?
I think it's super fun. I really enjoy it. I see a ton of use cases for it. It helps me edit things. It helps me ideate. It helps me push back. My skill is a lot more, especially from a writing perspective, on responding and editing my own writing than it is on writing. Like even with my EA, what I do is I verbalize all of my thoughts and she'll write it down and then I go through and then I can edit it super well. And that's just what works a lot better for me.
Yeah.
That being said, like it's super wrong a lot, like hilariously wrong. I wanted to pull up a real quote from a book called Propaganda by Edward Bernays. And in the book, they talk about where the word propaganda originated from. And it was from the 16th century. And it was the Catholic Church. They had a department, which was basically I don't know how to say it in Italian, but it was basically like the propaganda, like it was the propaganda department of the faith. So like it was their job to go into the new world and to propagate the faith. And they couldn't pull up the quote, and it's like, oh no, that's not where it comes from. And then I had to literally get the book, pull it out, write the quote, and like, oh sorry, yes, that is where it comes from. And I was like, okay, so there's so many little things that they get wrong. But I think it'll get increasingly right. But in the short term, my biggest fear is that people are going to take what they read as, it's kind of like when you Google something, you get the first answer, and that's just like an SEO based answer. It's not like
therefore it must be true because Google highlighted it.
And people this happened, like 2 lawyers got disbarred recently because they did a court case all off of ChatGPT. And they made up cases that had never happened. They submitted it. And it was like, oh, that's irresponsible.
Did they know they were making up cases?
No, they didn't know.
ChatGPT.
They thought they were real.
This is like a meme.
They didn't know it was real. Yeah,
that's insane.
Yeah. And so they got disbarred.
Wow.
And I just would caution people, as it gets better. And also, again, back to the Plato thing, like this is not a tool for remembering. This is not a tool for thinking. This is a tool for having been forgotten. And I would challenge you to leverage it as an incredibly powerful tool to make your life better. But not to let the tool use you.
So I want to go back to your story a little bit, because you said that when you were a kid, when you were a pretty young kid, I think you knew you wanted to be an entrepreneur because your dad was an entrepreneur. So that's just like the path that you thought you were going to take. But it took you quite a while to find your entrepreneurial niche, which I always find very interesting in people's stories, because I think it's very easy for people, especially young people, to feel like they have this dream of kind of the archetype that they want to fill, or just sort of the general position in the world they want to be in, but they don't quite know how to get there, and they don't quite know what their niche is. And that can be very disheartening. I struggled with this a lot early in my career, where I didn't really know what my niche was going to be. So I always find it interesting how people find those niches. How did you find yours? It sounds like a lot of it was emergent. You discovered that podcasts were interesting. You discovered that you were good at it. But can you talk a little bit more about that journey?
Yeah, for sure. And like realistically, I only wasn't an entrepreneur for like a year and a half of my life, probably. Like, you know, like started super young, like would go on the internet with my dad when I was super young. I was like, oh shit, I can buy these like light up toys from China and I can sell them to kids in school. Or I can buy candy and like sell them to kids in school. Or I can actually have a hilarious story. My friend Pierce and I in Hawaii where we were selling not lemonade, but guava juice from the stand. And it was like 10 in the morning. We're yelling, selling guava juice, you know, for like $1 or $2 for juice for like runners that would come by, and it was going well. And then this crazy lady who I guess was like strung out on some drugs or something across the street started screaming at us. We're like, oh, that's weird, whatever, but we're just going to keep going. And then she pulled out a gun, like a pellet gun, and started shooting at us.
Oh my.
So we like sprint away, and Pierce is like just under an Olympic athlete. Like he was D1 runner, like #1 long runner at Boulder, at CU Boulder.
Wait, so you're the friend that he just has to run faster then?
Exactly. Yeah, I was the friend who just has to run faster then. And we ended up getting paid hella money because we took her to court, and the state of Hawaii gave us like $300 to testify against her. So that was way better than we would have made from selling juice. Though we didn't sell any more juice after that. And then, you know, all throughout college, I would like create things that I thought were fun. So I did this experiment where I convinced 6 people to live in their waste for 8 weeks. I called it Project Consume. And I was like really into environmentalism, just growing up in Hawaii and in Northern California, and just like loving nature. And I just learned so much about recycling and how bullshit it is. And then a lot about consumption. And so we did this experiment. And because I thought people, the way like The Inconvenient Truth and all these things talk about it, is that they make the problem so big, the individual feels like they can't have an impact. So I wanted to take the macro, make it into a micro so people could learn through it, knowing that like macro is bullshit and you always look through things to the micro to find reality, I think. And what it became was just this experience of people realizing who they were as a pattern of what they consume. And it was so beautiful that, you know, we almost didn't talk about like environmentalism at all, which I'm all about not talking about it at that level, because what it was just a reflection, a mirror of who you are, because what you consume is who you become. Mm-hmm. And it helped people stop eating fast food, drink less, do all these like things that were super pivotal in their lives. And it was super fun. And then the problem for me with entrepreneurship my whole life, though, was like because of what my dad kind of had done, it was like, it wasn't necessarily about money. Again, it was this tool of how to mechanize the world I want to live in and a path to creating it. And so I just couldn't quite find the one that was the right thing for me for a long time. And I focused on social issues a lot because I love humans and I love a diversity of humans and I love diversity in general. I don't get super hung up on identity, but like I'm way more interested in, you know, a dude from Chengdu, China than I am like a 70-year-old white man from Indiana. No offense to the fam, but it's just something I find a lot more fascinating. I resonate with a lot more. I find more kinship with. And so I tend to focus on those issues and the stuff that I'm very passionate about. And I really dislike when people are mean to other people or think that people are lesser based off, you know, color of their skin or sexuality or whatever. I couldn't really find a good way to monetize that. And also it wasn't my battle to fight is what I realized in a lot of ways. 2 big things happened was I thought about creating a company called Friends of Faggots, and it was to take the power out of the word and like make all these shirts, and it was gonna be so sick. And I was talking to one of my really good friends, Joe, about it, and he's like, Sky, I love that you're doing this. And he's like, but trust me, bro, this isn't your fight and we're good. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like that isn't really, there's no real reason I should be involved in that.
Right.
And then another one was I was doing recruiting for the pharma company, and they would send me out to Howard, and I was picked actually by the Howard students that were in the company because they thought I had a very interesting take on Howard being a historically black college in DC.
Okay.
So everyone's black there. And I loved going out there. I loved experiencing the culture, and I loved being able to communicate with these students and hang out with them and show the opportunities that we had at this company. And one of the reasons why I was chosen was because it was important for them to see that coming to the Midwest wasn't like the worst thing ever, and to have somebody be from like Hawaii and California and still, find a good time, find good experiences there, because that was the hardest thing from, people from Louisiana or from DC or New York to think about sacrificing.
Yeah.
And then one time, one of the last times I was there, I just like announced like a massive scholarship that we were doing, where basically we'd pay for their second half tuition if they came to Lilly or to the pharma company I worked at. And I get in my Uber to go meet my other friend for dinner. And this dude picked me up, and he's black, and he was like, "What the fuck are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm here for the scholarship." Like, "No, you're not. You're here to fuck black girls." I'm like, "No, dude, I'm here to do this for." And he just like accosted me the entire drive home. And it made me really think like, maybe this isn't my fight either.
Right.
And so that was like right around the time where I started getting really into podcasting and really resonating. Like the thing that I think everybody's missing that will shift the world more than anything we do. Like the one thing is, if we can change the business model of media, we will fundamentally shift our sense-making apparatus, and we will therefore have the potential to live in a more sincere world. And so that's why it just kind of like became very apparent to me, like, okay, cool. This is the niche. This is my life's journey.
So you've alluded to this a couple of times throughout our conversation, but if you had to summarize what success in that looks like in changing our sense-making apparatus so we can live in a more sincere world, what does success look like?
So it looks like establishing the media as the product and the consumer as the customer. So said very simply, that would be like the one sentence. And that can look like many things, like the different models that we talked about. But really, if we can just get that right, that's what matters more than anything else. Because like right now, the customer is the advertiser. The consumer is the product. And again, it's just a misaligned incentive model. And the farther we go down that, the farther we integrate technology into our lives, with that being the main monetization pathway, the worse it's going to get. And it's gotten called out a lot in the last 2 or 3 years because of COVID and pharmaceuticals. And people think about this like incorrectly a lot, I think. Rogan always like misattributes that 70% of advertising spend on TV is from pharmaceuticals, and that's not true. The actual stat is that pharmaceuticals spend 70% of their budget on TV. But they do that because they know that it works.
Right.
And if we can just start to get rid of that middleman, that third party for monetization, that like elegant business model, we can at least have a world where we're getting closer to reality. And I don't think this is like we're going to live in some utopia after that happens. But what I do think is going to happen is we're going to give the humans the tools to actually educate themselves, to realize that there's not a third person trying to drive dissent within you and your neighbor. Like Chinese companies can buy advertising. They can buy Disney. They can influence the NBA. They can get people to not speak out on certain things that impact people in China or people in America based off of, because they will stop their streaming and they'll lose that advertising revenue. And we just built an incredibly fragile system in a world that's increasingly complex and need for nuanced ideas, that if we don't like switch paths, like we are going to hate each other, destroy each other, and crumble and be weaponized against each other, because we're allowing our reality to be defined by a third party that doesn't have our best reality in mind, like our best outcome in mind.
So you talked a lot about the mechanics of the system being, the incentives being off in such a way that it enables all of this. How much do you think it's just terrible incentives versus how much do you buy into like the more conspiratorial, like there are people who are deciding that these are the ideas that should get pushed, and these are the agendas of the era, and these are the things that that we want to be exposing people to? How much do you think is just causation from the poor incentives of the system versus something perhaps more insidious or more deliberate?
So I actually think those are the same. So if we think about like, the big name when you talk about like the New World Order, right? It's like the World Economic Forum at Davos. Who attends all the Davos meetings? Every single big Fortune 500 company who's advertising. So like, I don't think it's this cloak and dagger. I think it's right there in plain sight. I think it's incredibly obvious. It's kind of like when the Twitter files come out and you tell somebody who doesn't think it's crazy that, that the Biden administration had direct influence into, or like people at the White House or the FBI and CIA had direct influence into what was being censored or not censored on Twitter. People are like, oh, it's obvious.
Yeah.
And it is obvious. Like, it doesn't have to be this like deep, dark, romantic story. It's that these people have decided that this is what's within the Overton window, and therefore we're going to go that route. And I do think, like, I remember one of the other things I studied with environmentalism is, and this has been around since the 70s, it becomes incredibly obvious that the most easy answer to our environmental problem is to have less people. But that's like such a short, and this is like in all environmental movements throughout all of history, but it's such like a short viewpoint, and it doesn't really optimize for, I think, our entire society and what we're trying to going for at all. And I think it's a negative thing to have less people, but that's the obvious answer. So it makes sense that a lot of people who don't want to go too deep into it, let's figure out ways to have less people. So to me, that's not like it's inherently rational for their model of the world. But like some of my favorite thoughts around this are like, before Henry Ford normalized the car and was able to produce it at scale, both like London Times and New York Times or London Herald and New York Times were writing all of these doomsday articles about how if like people are moving into cities at alarming rates and we're never going to be able to keep up with the horse manure, and in 10 years, it's going to be 2 stories tall and you can't get it out of the city as much as we can. But then we built a new technology and nobody remembers that. And so I'd rather bet on having more people building new technologies, being better educated, than I would on like decreasing population to save the environment. So that's like a roundabout way to answer your question, I guess.
Does that have anything to do with you being Mormon pilled? Are those things correlated, or is that a separate thing?
No, that was just, I thought like, I've always been really interested in Mormonism because they're the most successful religion in America, and they're like an American religion. And I didn't realize how much manifest destiny was like infused into the concept. I was on a plane flying back from my homie's dad's funeral, and I sat next to this Mormon dude, and I was just super curious, like wanted to read it. And it really seemed like such an American ideal that they put into this new religion. And it has, all the mythology and silliness of a religion. But it also had this like very kind of individualism. You find your own way. You ask your questions. Like he had told me, the Mormon dude, like, the priests are saying this. I don't know what they're called. I guess priests, I don't know. Whatever they're called. Sorry, Mormons. And, the Book of Mormon says this. And he went to his father because he was having, a moral dilemma. And he was like, well, you have to actually ask yourself, and like God will present the answer through you. And that is something that I actually love, because it's like where I kind of get not stoked on Christianity or Catholicism specifically. It comes like so top down. It's such an obviously power structure move.
That sounds a little like created. Quakerism is kind of a similar, like the Quakers,
which is also super American.
Yeah, the Quakers believe that like they don't in their services, they don't have a minister at the front of the building talking to you. Like often their churches are built to where like the pews are facing each other, so it's not all in a row facing the front, and you just sit in silence and commune with God until someone feels moved anyone in the congregation feels moved to speak if they feel like they have something that they want to share. But it's much more about turning inward to have a spiritual experience as opposed to turning outward and having someone talk to you, which I've always found really interesting.
For sure. And I think that's how most religions developed. Like even if you take the Catholic Mass, like I think the idea is you're supposed to sit with God, and then you have communion, and then you commune. But them sitting with God is just the priest like jamming like weirdly toned brainwashing into your face.
It's like any institution. It becomes top heavy, top down, standardized. It becomes something where you can just sort of go through the motions and check the boxes in the same way you can go into the education system and you can, go to your classes, take the test, check the boxes, and never actually have to independently learn something on your own. It's the same idea. I think it happens to every large institution. It kind of follows the same evolution or devolution, depending on your opinion of it, but the same path.
I think that's just like the first part of the path that always happens. Because I think that like the tension that we feel as humans is this tension of fighting entropy and giving up to entropy. And like I kind of feel like I like summarize some sort of morality that sounds super like super cocky, but I was just like, really thinking about it and like thinking about entropy. And if we assume entropy, which is just basically expansion or chaos, as a fundamental principle of the universe, like as far as we know, the universe is just continuing to expand and things break down and just expand. And I think like moral humans, they act in locally controlling entropy. So you can expand local to a certain point, but at some, I think, obvious point, it becomes very non-local. But I do think that is moral. And I do think that we seek to do that. Like we are entropy fighting machines as humans. And I think that when things start to non-locally control entropy, that's when we're talking about that state that you're speaking of. And I think that would be immoral. But I do think the universe eventually comes around and like thrusts entropy upon us, right? So things are always in this tension of centralizing, decentralizing, centralizing, decentralizing, centralizing, decentralizing.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about this as a bit of a tangent, but one of the things that I find really interesting about the way that you tell your story is you talk about all of these people who influenced you really early on, especially podcasters. Like you were emailing with Ryan Holiday, which is super cool that he was like an actual legitimate mentor, not just someone you were listening to on a podcast, but you were interacting with him.
Sorry to interrupt, but one thing that's really funny about this is I'm like 99% sure, and I've never spoken to him about this, that he doesn't know that the Sky King he actually knows as a human is the same one that was emailing him in 2016 or whatever. Like I don't think he's ever connected the dots, and I've never like brought it up to him.
That's really funny.
When I have him on podcast, I'll let him know.
But that what you just said is the exact point that I was getting at, is you were observing these people from the outside and as a fan, as if someone who's aspiring to be in their world. And now you know Ryan Holiday in real life, and you don't know that he even knows that you were the kid who was emailing him in 2016.
Yeah.
That he's like a real person to you now, and you're a real person to him. He knows who you are.
Yeah.
And you've become, Aubrey Marcus. You were a fan, and then you worked for him, and then he encouraged you to go start your own business. He became a mentor, I assume. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would assume that's a fair characterization. And you've had that experience with so many different podcasters, thinkers, like people in this alternative media world that you've immersed yourself in. And I feel like that's a really hard bridge for people to cross sometimes, or gap for people to bridge rather, where they get kind of caught in the being impressed phase, and it's hard to transition. Like I find it hard to be a fan and to be involved at the same time.
Yeah.
Like I felt like I've had to, in my own journey, like snap myself out of being a fangirl if I want to actually have a conversation with somebody and integrate into their world. How did you do that in the early stages of your journey? Like how did you bridge the gap between being a fan and then actually being involved with people?
Yeah, I made many mistakes at this. I can definitely say that.
Tell me about all of them.
The first time I got Ryan on Aubrey's podcast, Aubrey was like running late, so I was just sitting with him in a room. I was word vomiting so many fucking questions, and he's like, "What the fuck?" Like he was definitely like,
he's like, "Wait, is this the interview?"
Yeah, he's like, "This is a bit odd," and like it's hard because you know so much more about them than they know about you.
Yeah.
Even Aubrey's. My first interview with him, he asked me questions for about 20 minutes. He's like, "Do you have any for me?" And I just basically asked him questions for an hour. And I went super deep into stuff. I was like, "How depressed are you today?" Because he's talked about struggling with depression again.
Yeah.
And he actually gave a really high number. What's cool about that is about 2 years later, I sent him like a message and I was like, "Dude, I was just going through my old journals and I took notes from our meeting and it said that you were a 7 out of 10 depressed. How depressed do you feel today?" And he's like, "Wow, thanks so much for reflecting that, man." I'm like a 0.7. Like, holy shit, like what a journey. I'm like, "Yeah, dude, this is fucking wild." So I've simplified it to this, and it's Ford. And I didn't make this up. It was something that was taught to me when I was in college by a mentor. And when you're meeting them for the first time, you slow yourself down and you just say, "Where are you from?" And everybody will have a different answer. Even though you know a lot about them, they'll have a different answer for that probably. It means something different to them. "What do you do for work?" And ask this in a way that's sincere. So you know what they do for work. They're a writer. But like, how would you describe what you do for work? And maybe they say, like maybe they're a podcaster. They say, "Oh, I'm an author," or "I'm a comedian," or "I'm a communicator." And then you say, what'd you do for fun last week? And so what do you do for recreation? So that's the R. And like, "Oh shit, I'm learning how to do jujitsu." Like, "Oh, how's it going?" Boom, branching into a new conversation. And then like, "What do you want to do? Like, what are your dreams? What are your goals with that?" And it gives them, because when you approach somebody and you know everything about them, they're immediately feeling bad. Like, "Fuck, do I know this person? Should I know their name? How can I forget them?" Like all this stuff. And then they slowly realize, "Oh, they listen to my podcast." And then you're in this wall. Whereas you start out with like curiosity, not going up to them like, oh my God, like conspiracy was so good. Why didn't it sell more books? And they're like, not only do you know my work, you know, in depth that this book didn't do as well as this book did. And it can be overwhelming. It's just really ease into it with like a sincere curiosity of trying to learn more about them and giving them the opportunity to set the tone. Then often they'll then ask the next question. Where are you from?
Do you, when you initiate those conversations, do you let them know that you have context on them, that you know who they are and you've listened to their stuff, or do you go in totally cold?
So what I usually like to do is, because it's in a small network right now of people, like, so ran into Lex for the first time. I was like, hey, what's up, man? I'm Sky. I know Matt. And he's like, oh shit, how do you know Matt? And I'm like, oh, we do the same stuff. I actually did the Onnit deal for you. And he's like, oh, sick. No way, thank you. Like, so what do you do? You know what I mean? So like there's easier ways in when it's a network. When it's totally cold, like I would start with like almost no contextualization. And then you can kind of like start to let them like, oh yeah, I know the podcast. And it's not really about being fake. It's just about making it comfortable for them.
Right. So you wouldn't go up and be like, oh my gosh, you're Lex Friedman.
Where are you from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd be like, hey, I'm Sky.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Where are you from?
Yeah.
Interesting. Even if you already know the answers to some of these questions too.
I think there's a way that I can phrase the question where it's being sincere. And again, like I know Lex went to MIT and then was like a researcher at MIT. I know his family's from Russia. I think he was born there. I'm not sure. You know what I mean? There's nuances within that. And I always like to be curious about what people answer that question from. And I think if you ask that question in a way that is sincerely curious, you'll get a good response back, as opposed to, I'm from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Where it's like,
even then you get a foothold. Like, well, we're in Texas. Like, I love Texas.
You go
we're in
deeper
Texas.
into the,
Or I hate Texas. We're in Texas. I'm so sorry. Whatever. Are these questions that you would sincerely ask a person that you didn't know?
For sure. That's how I immediately established like any kind of bonding.
So if it's unnatural for someone to ask, where are you from? Like they wouldn't ask anyone else if they were talking to that question. I would assume it's helpful to think of find questions that you would naturally ask a person you didn't know and kind of filter those into the same model.
For sure. I think that would totally work. Yeah. This one's worked super well for me because you get them to start talking about themselves. Also, because I've lived in a lot of places, like from cool, I can like, oh, sick. Yeah, I love San Clemente. It's like my favorite place to surf. Like you can establish stuff really fast.
Yeah.
So I found this one works because everybody wants to talk about one of those 4 things.
Yeah.
Like from what you do for work, what you do for recreation, what you do for your dreams. I think people make the error often is they go straight, what do you for work? And then it feels weird because it's like, are they looking for status? Like they want something from me. So I like softening into that. But again, like pretty aspy. So it's like really helpful for me to have that in my head or else like social things, I'll just sit there quietly and like, so just like I can run through things.
It's tough when you're, because I mean, I always do. One of my best friends says that I do my best work when I'm clueless, and she's totally right. Yeah. Like when I don't know who I'm talking to, I'm great. Yeah. But if I have context on somebody, it's really easy to get in your own head because it's like, well, do I have to tell them that I have context? Do I have to come up with like a really nuanced question that shows that I've clearly read all of their work and have some deep thought to contribute to this? Mm-hmm. Do I ask them a question that like relates to my thing? But then how do I, make the intersection in a way that gets their attention? Like it feels like there's pressure and it's harder. It's definitely been a learning journey for me too over the years. But so having something specific to ask people is, it helps a lot. And for you, when you were meeting these different people, it sounds like a lot of it happened by nature of your work. Like you kind of got your foot in the door. You were working with Aubrey. So then you were face to face with some of these people and you were able to interface with them. And then, you start getting invited to events, you start running into people at parties, I would assume. You start having more opportunities for these interactions. Like I feel like once you have your foot in the door, the whole game changes.
You can still biff it though. Like even like the first time I hung out with Malice, it's just like, so what do you think about Xi Jinping? And he's like, hey, I'm Michael. I'm like, hey, I'm Sky.
Anyway, what do you think? No. Yeah. What about, so when you see somebody that you haven't interacted with before and you're a fan of them, or you just know who they are, but especially if you're a fan, what's your approach to like how cool do you play it when like you see Lex at an event? Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh, wow, that's Lex Friedman. I'm a big fan. I want to go talk to him. Do you like just go right over and insert yourself into the conversation that he's in? Do you find him when he's unavailable, like when he's not talking to anybody else? Do you try to catch him when he's talking to somebody else that you know? Do you have a strategy for this or do you just kind of like wing it?
So this is something that's taken a lot of work and also just spending a lot of time around like famous people growing up and watching people interact with them. Mm-hmm. Is I release, first thing I do, feel like, oh, excited to meet that person. And then I release that excitement and just assume it's going to happen naturally, which is what I did with Lex. And then the Lex thing happened because I was in a conversation with the Side Surfs, and I think Warren was like, Lex had asked Warren like where he can get water, and Warren's like, Sky. And I was like, Sky, where can you get water? And so I was like, oh, I can show you, bro. And then
Nice.
So just like I think allowing the universe to unfold as it should.
What about like you're at a big party, you're at like a house party with like 100 people or something, and you see people that you want to talk to, but like the chances of interfacing with them are slim. Do you have a more direct approach to try to get into the conversation, or do you just still kind of like let it happen?
Wing it.
And sometimes
because I assume it's going to happen again. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's my MO. That's why I'm asking. That's been my MO, and I've met a lot of really cool people in Austin too. But there also are people where like I've been at the same party with them probably a dozen times, and I still haven't had like I've talked to them a little bit. I think they know who I am. Like they kind of like smile and wave when they see me, so there's like a little bit of context, but I've never like had a deep conversation at a level where it feels like they know what I do. There's some level of like mutual connection. Like it's not a useful connection. It's just like a very like kind of surface level social connection. And I'm just sort of operating under the assumption that like it'll happen eventually.
Yeah.
But I sometimes don't know if that's a flawed assumption. If I'm being too passive about it.
For sure. I think having watched people like force their way into things, it just really leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
It does.
And like it'll just happen as like, you know, people are just circulating. I like do, I think, a good job of like putting people in those positions of people they want to talk to.
You did that for me the other day. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I do that often. And a lot of it's just because like I don't like talking in groups. So it's like a good exit for me. So I can go be alone or just with one other person really fast.
That's amazing. You can throw me in anytime just for
sweet. Yeah. And it's because, you know, I have insider knowledge on like what would be interesting to that person, what would be interesting to that person, and why it'd be compelling. And it's like fun. And I tend to be thinking, and the reason why I struggle in groups is I tend to be thinking about all of the other people around me. And it's just super overwhelming and stimulating. And so it's just like, ooh, I can solve this problem really quickly. But other than that, like, honestly, like I think the less you try, the more you get in these situations. Like put yourself in the right rooms, be interesting, then, you know, have compelling things, be interested in people. And then those people will pull the other people to you, you know? Like I fundamentally believe that. It's very much like a Wu Wei or like, you know, life is water kind of thing. But I think a lot of people who end up forcing themselves into the rooms, they end up getting the thing they want, and it ends up leading them down a path they probably didn't want to be in anyway. So like becoming too big too fast.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways that you can force it and make it really unnatural. Also, you can do more harm than good, I think, if you don't actually have something to say. You're just trying to check the box.
Exactly.
You can tell who those people are in a room. Yeah.
Somebody asked me like if I got a photo with this comedian. And I was like, it literally, until he had asked me that last night, it never even crossed my mind. And I wasn't being rude to him. I was like, I've never really thought about getting a photo with a famous person, mate. Like, yeah.
I've gotten photos a couple of times with people that I've met, like after spending like 4 hours talking to them, like, hey, could we like grab a selfie real quick or something when it feels natural?
For sure.
But it's like, what's the point of getting a picture and saying, hey, look, I can show my grandkids that I met this person. It's not meaningful. I don't want to be a fan.
Yeah.
I decided this a long time ago. I don't want to be a fan. I want to be a player in the game. And a player in the game is not overly impressed by the other players. They respect game.
Yeah.
But they're not so captured by it that they think that the other players are somehow. It's a weird balance because you don't want you want to have humility too and respect for other people's the things that they're good at, but you can't think of them as some other class of people if you're also aspiring to build something.
They'll always be a different class if you think about them that way.
Yeah, you'll never get there. You can never. You can't be involved at the same time.
Yeah, one of the best lessons I learned from Aubrey too is fostering presence.
Ooh.
And I think that's like what he's honestly gifted at. And like if you can figure out a way, and something I'm working on aggressively right now, to hold yourself that things are just coming to you. You have a gravitational pull. I tend to think that'll work better.
How do you foster that presence?
I think you do a lot of deep internal work. You know, you become really comfortable with yourself.
Are there things in particular that you've found helpful in the pursuit of this? I feel like we could have a whole separate 2-hour-long conversation about this. This is one of my favorite topics, but briefly, I'd love to know.
This is something I'm still working on, but I would say, don't lean on crutches of substances. That changes your energy, and it changes like how you are around people. You focus a lot on having like depending on what presence you want to foster, right? Like Alex Jones is fostering a very different presence than what I'm going for here, right?
Yeah.
He's loud, yelling and loud and like blah, blah, blah. And he pulls people to him that way.
Yeah.
The one I'm more interested in, again, is this like quiet gravitational, which I have a lot more when I'm sober versus like when I'm drinking. Like when I'm drinking, it's a lot more of like, okay, I'm just going to put these people together and then I can like manically escape.
Which is fun too.
It's fun too. It's definitely like people get drawn to that and they enjoy it, but it's just like.
I do like drunk Sky.
Yeah.
But also I like sober Sky.
Yeah. And then I do think spending, like, if you can start to spend, and this is something where when I fostered the biggest presence in my life was also when I like had the biggest windfalls, was when I was just sitting alone in the morning for an hour. And I wouldn't even call it like meditating or guided meditation. I would just sit and watch my mind fall down and just imagine like myself falling endlessly and like things would come up and go away. And I just was able to get a lot more still. And I think in a lot of the great teachers, and like shamanic teachers or spiritual teachers, I think that's one thing that they've done very well, is just fostered the ability to let go and to feel very present. And that present is what gives that presence.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a thing I've spent a lot of time over the years learning how to foster. And I definitely have seen sort of an accelerating curve of success in my life that's corresponded with the amount of effort I've put into developing not just presence. I almost see developing presence as like a side effect of doing the work. It's just a happy accident. Because if you're just going for establishing presence, you're never going to succeed because you're trying to force a thing that cannot be forced. Like by definition, it has to be a thing that's just organically stemming from 100%. You. But for me, I feel like it's been a combination of one, like, you talk about the falling thing. For me, it's more like I become aware of the part of my mind that's just the observer and it's just watching everything else. And I sort of like step out of the emotions and like the part of me that's captured, and I sort of reconnect to just like how expansive my reality is. And when you tap back into that, all the little things that you're worried about, it's like, oh no, I'm so scared to go talk to Lex Friedman across the room. It's like, you're like a cosmic being living in this like incredibly enormous universe with endless possibilities, and you're afraid to go talk to this like physicist dude over there who's at the same party. Yeah, like come on. Like it helps you just sort of become more zen. And I feel like the more you tap back into that, the easier it becomes to reconnect to that in any given moment, which gives you a lot of presence, because that calm is really, I think I find myself very drawn to people who are calm, but also who are confident. And so there's also a level of, you become, as you sort of coalesce your confidence, your self-esteem, your self-efficacy, your purpose, the vision of like what you're building and what you're becoming. That doesn't even have to be like a thing that you put into words, but I think it's a thing that you feel internally. Like there's just a resonance that is like true to your essence. Or at least that's how I describe it to myself. And the more you kind of like come into alignment with that, I feel like the more my presence expands.
100%. I really do think it's getting in alignment with yourself. Like that's really what it is, and you're not,
Yeah, which is a hard thing to do. And the world is...
It's the hero's journey.
Yeah, everything in the world is set against you. But if you can, I mean, it's a lifelong journey. But the farther down the road you can get, the more cool life experiences seem to open up, which is part of the magic.
100%.
Sky, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch on before we wrap this?
I mean, there's so many things.
I know.
No, this has been awesome. Surfing? Yeah.
Go.
Well, I would say like that would be the other thing I would say to help foster presence, because you're just dealing with like, so when you're thinking about like the party atmosphere we were just describing and how to navigate that, like a party is like a lot of variables that you have to think through, right? And like surfing, I think especially in the ocean, is almost you're dealing with so many complex systems that the only thing like your overactive brain, your fear centers can do is get in the way of your capacity to ride the wave. And I just think there's like, I've never learned more from anything than I have surfing. So
that's awesome. You're making me want to go. Surfing. I'm out of here. I'm going to go find some waves. Sky, thank you so much for this. This has been so much fun.
For sure.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.